Welcome to the Aslan Media Book Club. Our featured author today is Sadakat Kadri. He is the author of Heaven on Earth, A Journey Through Sharia Law from the Deserts of Ancient Arabia to the Streets of the Modern Muslim World, a book that's been getting a lot of attention lately on both sides of the Atlantic. Sadakat, thanks so much for joining us on Aslan Media.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, a book about Sharia. As you know, in the United States, we've got some 23 states now that are trying to pass anti-Sharia laws. A lot of Sharia hysteria here in America. You've studied this issue back and forth, from the ancient ideas to modern conceptions. What do you think is the source of this overwhelming fear and hysteria in the U.S. About Sharia? Where's it come from?
Well, first of all, I should say it doesn't have anything to do with history. That's one of the things that I try to make clear throughout the book. But I think the answer is pretty simple. I mean, people are frightened, and there are reasons why they're frightened. I was here during September the 11th. I was in London on the bombings that we call 7/7. There are extremist Muslims out there who do justify their actions according to Islamic law, but that isn't what Sharia is. That's what I try to show in the book. I show in the book that the development of Islamic law is something which has taken place over 1,400 years. It took root precisely because it was able to accommodate different customs and different traditions peacefully, and that's what I would argue it can do in the United States today. I mean, if there are genuine fears about Islamic extremism, then it's those interpretations of Islamic law that should be countered, not the Sharia in general.
Well, I'm curious because, of course, you spend your time both in the U.S. and in the U.K. The U.K. has a vastly different relationship with Sharia, right? I mean, there are active Sharia courts both in the U.S. and in the U.K., but they seem to be a lot less, fear-inducing in the UK than they are in the US.
Well, there is panic in the UK as well. I wouldn't want to say that everyone in the UK is entirely rational about this either. And the differences actually can be exaggerated as well, because we don't have Sharia courts. We don't have courts which are imposing their rules on people who don't want to have the rules imposed on them.
No, of course.
What we have are tribunals and an arbitration panel. So if people want to bring their arguments to Islamic scholars, if it's entirely consensual, then that's permitted in the UK. But it also is in the United States. And I emphasize that it has to be consensual, because if there's any suggestion of compulsion, if there's any suggestion of discrimination or violation of, in England, the Human Rights Act, or over here, the Bill of Rights, then that's challengeable in the courts. And that's entirely proper as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and I guess the issue is that that's never a concern. I mean, we in the United States have something called the Supremacy Clause that forbids any foreign law from taking precedence over the Constitution, which is kind of funny to me with all these people, particularly presidential candidates, talking about a constitutional amendment banning Sharia. My argument is we already have that. It's called the Constitution.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, there are arguments which are put forward by criminals in certain cases, saying that they were acting for the greater glory of God. I mean, obviously in the case of terrorist acts, but also there have been cases of honour killings, certainly in the United Kingdom, where people have run that argument. There have been cases of domestic violence where people have claimed that they're divinely authorised to do all sorts of terrible things to their spouse. But those arguments aren't accepted, and they're not acceptable. And those arguments have been struck down or overthrown on appeal. And that's the way that it should be. That's the way that a secular legal system should operate.
One of the things that's really fascinating about your book is that you discovered that in some places Sharia is actually quite a progressive force, isn't it? Can you give us some examples of that?
Well, what I'd say is that the Sharia is a way of interpreting. Sorry, let me start that again. The approaches to Islamic law can be progressive, because the crucial question is who's doing the interpreting and how Islamic laws are being interpreted. In Iran, for example, I came across plenty of people who had views very, very different from those which prevail at the top of the government. I had people who, the very first cleric that I spoke to in Iran, I talked to about the question of veiling.
Yeah.
there was a discussion about whether or not European countries were right to ban the veil. Now, I obviously think that it's entirely improper that European countries should be telling should be telling women what not to wear, or what to wear for that matter. But this Iranian cleric turned around and he said, well, whatever they do in Europe, that's Europeans' business. The question is, what are we doing in Iran? Why are we forcing women to wear veils? That's contrary to the Sharia. Now, to me, that came as a complete surprise because, I went to Iran just assuming that the Islamic clerics take the view that veils are compulsory. But the first person that I met said exactly the opposite. And across Iran, I met people who had very, very different views about the Sharia, who were very hostile to the government, very often on religious grounds.
Well, so this brings up another really interesting issue that you tackle in the book, which is the enormous diversity of Sharia. In the West, of course, particularly in the United States, there's this impression that there's this monolithic, unchanging thing out there called Sharia, but of course nothing can be further from the truth, right?
No, I mean, what's happened in the last 4 decades particularly is that certain harsh, hardline interpretations of the Sharia have taken hold in a handful of Muslim states like Iran, for example, Pakistan, northern Nigeria. But these priorities aren't the priorities that ordinary Muslims have. Ordinary Muslims simply want to do the right thing by God. They want a stable, predictable, and ordered life. Now, in countries which have been racked by wars and revolutions and coups, that does unfortunately mean that extremist interpretations of the Sharia have made headway. But there are plenty of other places, and particularly in the West, where no one thinks about imposing the criminal penalties laid down in the 7th century in the Quran and in the Hadiths. The primary concerns are things like charity, they're things like marriage, they're customs, how you mourn your dead, and it's those aspects of the Sharia, forgiveness and tolerance and discretion, which I think have typified understandings of Islamic law for the last 1400 years, and it's very, very important to focus on those traditions today, rather than on the hardline interpretations which a minority of people in other countries in the Muslim world have chosen to focus on.
Last question. So in all your travels and all the discussions that you had, I mean, you're an English barrister, you also can practice law in New York, so you're obviously quite familiar with the law in general, and of course your background from South Asia gives you a sense of the cultural elements involved. But I'm curious if anything really just blew you away, just completely surprised you about Sharia or the expression of Sharia as it is lived, or even discussions that you had with people. Is there anything that you can think of that just kind of completely surprised you?
Well, I think, I mean, the most surprising thing to me was that was just the extent of the Sharia. I mean, I came to this project thinking that the Sharia was going to be laid down in books somewhere, that it was going to be a list of rules, a code of punishments, perhaps, rules about how you should conduct your life. But actually, it's an entire approach towards the worship of God. And it's an approach which has thrived and done the Muslim community wonders for 1400 years. That's why it's survived and thrived so effectively. I mean, it covers things like the exorcism of jinns, one of the things that I cover, that I write about at the beginning of the book. It covers things like marriage, like manners, like how you dress and how you eat. To think of it as a body of law can be very, very misleading, and that does underpin a lot of the hysteria, I think, in the West against the Sharia, because actually it's an approach towards doing the right thing by God. The Sharia means in Arabic the path. Originally it meant a path towards water, path to the route that one takes to achieve salvation. And to ban that, as far as a devout Muslim is concerned, amounts to setting oneself against God. It's not the Sharia that should be attacked insofar as one's frightened of Islamic extremism. It's extremist interpretations of Islamic law. And that, I think, is the primary message of my book.
The book is called Heaven on Earth, A Journey Through Sharia Law from the Deserts of Ancient Arabia to the Streets of the Modern Muslim World. Sadakat Kadri, thank you so much for talking to Aslan Media.
Thank you very much for having me on.